Hello and welcome to the certification program.
Brought to you by PEAK. PEAK is an initiative of Ensystems Advisory Private Limited.
Thank you for joining us. Today we will be discussing the basics of solar PV systems and the benefits that these solutions can have for both commercial and industrial organizations. In today's discussion, we will be covering aspects of what is solar PV systems, how do you calculate key parameters for solar PV systems, and also have a fireside chat with an expert about the benefits of these solutions and also the challenges that India has faced in large-scale adoption of these technologies. In addition to talking about what is solar PV and what are distributed solar systems, we will talk about the potential for solar rooftop PV in India. We will also talk about what are the prevalent business models and what is the regulatory landscape like in India. At the end, we will cover a little bit about the internship project and the assignment and the information you will need to submit your assignment. In the past decade, sustainability and clean energy has come to the forefront with respect to decision-making for governments, international organizations, private organizations, academic institutions, etc. On the one hand, consumer demands are increasing and more energy is required to fulfill these requirements. The power generation is currently dependent excessively on fossil fuels. These fossil fuels are responsible for a significant portion of the greenhouse gases emitted in the world. With increasing awareness and realization of the climate change threat, fossil fuels are no longer a viable solution or even sustainable or economically viable anymore. Renewable power uses renewable energy sources such as solar or wind energy for production of energy. In addition to these resources being abundantly available around us, these solutions also produce drastically lower greenhouse gas emissions. With developments in technology over the past 2 decades, renewable energy systems have now started to become the preferred source of energy around the world. So what are solar PV systems? Solar photovoltaic systems are technologies that convert sunlight into electrical energy. The solar panels are made up of multiple solar cells, which are most commonly made out of silicon. The electricity generated from this module is then sent to an inverter, which converts the direct current to an alternating current, which is what is required by most of the loads in our domestic, commercial, or industrial complexes. From the inverter, the power is used to power the loads in this building. In some cases, this energy goes to a battery storage system. In this, the excess energy which is generated can be used to provide energy in non-sunlight hours. Solar PV systems generate electricity only during sunlight hours. To illustrate the concept of battery storage a little better, let's take a look at this graph. If the orange curve that you see on your screen is the typical load profile of any building, which indicates the amount of energy they consume during a 24-hour period, the light blue curve that you see, that's the solar energy production from a solar PV system that they have installed either on their rooftop or a ground-mounted system on the premises. So during the peak hours between 8 to 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., if the solar energy is more than what the building can consume, this energy can be used and stored in a battery storage system, which can then be later consumed in non-storage hours. So this helps the establishment in further reducing its bill from the electricity distribution company. Solar technologies in India can either be solar thermal or solar PV systems. For today's discussion, we will be focusing on solar PV systems. In this, you can have a large-scale utility power plant or distributed solar systems which are installed at the site of consumption. These can be either connected to the grid or can be independent systems. Now, each of these can further be with or without the battery storage system that we saw on the earlier slide. Distributed solar PV systems can be installed on the roof of a building, on the ground around the building, on lampposts, elevated structures on the rooftop, or even carports. Let's understand a little more about what is the potential of solar rooftop PV solutions in India right now. So India has a target of achieving 175 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2022. Of this 175, 100 gigawatts is expected to come from solar power plants. Let's take a look at what the source-wise breakup was of the power generation in this state. As of December 31st, 2019, 63% of the power generated is from thermal sources, 23% from renewable energy, 12% from hydropower, and 2% from nuclear sources. Now, within this 23%, a significant chunk is around 44% from wind power, 37% from large-scale utility power plants. Solar rooftop solutions are only about 3%. Key consumers for solar rooftop PV systems are institutional buildings, commercial buildings, industrial complexes, and residential buildings. Solar PV for residential buildings is still in the initial stages of growth. From 2015 to now, solar rooftop PV has grown from around 700 megawatts to around 5.4 gigawatts as of 2019 December. MNRE has a goal of achieving 40 gigawatt of solar rooftop PV solutions by 2022. Of this, close to 16 gigawatts, which is around 40%, is expected to come from only small and medium enterprises. Let's understand a little more about what are the business models and what is the regulatory landscape for solar rooftop PV solutions. For commercial and industrial consumers, there are predominantly two main business models. One is the CAPEX and one is the Opex. In the CAPEX model, the customer pays for the system and the installation. They either do their own maintenance or they take up maintenance contracts with solar companies. The energy generated here is used for their own consumption. If excess energy is generated, they can either transmit this back into the grid and avail of net metering benefits, which we will cover in subsequent slides, or they can use this energy for storage using battery technology. Coming to the Opex model, in this a third party pays for the solar rooftop solution on the premises of a commercial or an industrial building. The third party owns the energy generated from the system. He in turn sells this energy to the building management, who pays for it based on a power purchase agreement or a contractual obligation between all the parties involved. The third party is responsible for the maintenance of the system. In an Opex model, any benefit received, such as net metering, is availed by the third party entity who has actually paid for the solar system. So there are various policies which the government, both central and state government, has included to support the adoption of solar rooftop PV solutions. One of these are renewable purchase obligations. Renewable purchase obligation is a mechanism in which the obligated entities, such as the electricity distribution companies or larger power consumers, they are obligated to consume and purchase a specific portion of their energy from renewable energy sources such as solar or wind. RPOs are further categorized as solar or non-solar RPOs. In Maharashtra for 2020-21, the solar RPO has been set to 4.5% and is likely to increase in the next few years. Now, if the obligated entity is unable to meet the RPO obligations, they can purchase renewable energy certificates or RECs from an exchange platform such as IEX. One REC is equivalent to 1 megawatt hour of energy. These RECs can help in meeting the RBO obligation of the entity if they are unable to procure energy from RE sources themselves. The floor price of a solar RPO is 0 rupees and the forbearance price of the solar RPO is currently at around 1000 rupees per REC. So there is a process involved in terms of accreditation and registering in order to trade in RECs, and this process is facilitated by the State Energy Development Agency. There is another feature of gross and net metering. The key difference between gross metering and net metering is the way in which the consumer gets paid or benefited from the solar energy generated by the system. In gross metering, based on a fixed feed-in tariff, the DISCOM compensates for the solar energy that has been fed into the grid, and the customer pays the distribution company for the number of units consumed based on a retail tariff. In net metering, however, the consumer will sell the excess energy to the grid, and the consumer is billed for the energy consumed from the grid minus the energy that he has supplied to the grid. Each state has different policies regarding net metering and gross metering. Generally, for different categories of consumers, the rules and regulations are very different. For example, Maharashtra and Kerala and Rajasthan do not allow net metering beyond 1 megawatt. Tamil Nadu does not allow net metering for its industrial customers. Odisha does not have a maximum limit for any solar projects to be connected under net metering. Uttar Pradesh has withdrawn the net metering rules both for its commercial and its industrial customers. Let's go a little into details on how you can do your internship assignment. This is a typical model to calculate what your payback period is. There is a tool attached here which you will have access to do your further calculations. But let's just run through a couple of values that you see on your screen. The values in green are the ones that you will have to identify by speaking to either an industrial or a commercial organization in your area. The grid tariff is something that you can either get by talking to these organizations or by looking at the electricity bills of these organizations. The grid tariff escalation we can consider for around 5% year on year with a cap of around 15 rupees here. The area available on the rooftop or on the ground around the premises can be found by speaking with the stakeholder that you want to assess this model for. The area required per kilowatt can be considered to be around 15 square meters. So based on this, based on the area available to the customer, you can figure out what the possible size of the solar system is. Now, a solar system typically generates around 4.5 units per kilowatt per day. Now, if we assume the capital cost to be around 50,000 rupees per kilowatt, based on that, you can calculate what the capital cost of your system is. Now, if you assume that your maintenance cost is at around 1.6% of your capital cost, with an escalation of around 7%, you can use these numbers to figure out what your operational cost would be. So using this information and the tool provided, you are requested to provide more details about who is the customer, what kind of premises does the customer have, what is the kind of area he has available, what benefits are you expecting to see from the solar rooftop system, and what would be the ideal payback for a solar PV rooftop system that he has installed. In addition to this, it would also be interesting to see that if you add layers of net metering or battery storage, what is the kind of impact that this has on a solar rooftop PV system. So this will be the template that you will need to use for your final submission for a business pitch for rooftop PV systems. In this, you will need to include details of what is the selected site and the consumer that you have chosen, what are the benefits that you envisage for this customer, what are the details of the system that you have designed for this system, and also what are the payback calculations. You will need to also include that if you were to pitch this idea to a customer, what would your business pitch be?
Hello and welcome to the Fireside Chat on the Renewable Energy Systems, brought to you by PEAK, an initiative of Ensystems Advisory Private Limited. We are joined today for this Fireside Chat by Dr. Mahesh Patankar. Dr. Patankar is the founder and managing director of Ensystems Advisory Private Limited. He has over 28 years of experience in energy efficiency, renewable energy, clean transport and sustainable agriculture policy, and urban agri-industrial water. He has undertaken projects around the world in India, South and Southeast Asia, Europe, South Africa, and South America. He has worked as a consultant, as an individual, and as a firm. with the World Bank Group, ADB, and a number of other multilateral and bilateral funding agencies, including philanthropies. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Mahesh.
Glad to be here, Meghna.
Great. So let's begin today's fireside chat. Uh, as someone who has been in this sector for the past couple of decades, I think my first question to you is what is the biggest change that you have witnessed as far as renewable energy in India has been over the past few decades?
Okay, so when you look at any kind of transition from one type of technologies to the other type of technologies, I think one needs to take on board a couple of things. Firstly, the technology transitions, and other one is the commercial transitions. If we just look at the technology part of it, the efficiencies of different types of renewable energy sources have changed substantially. So, to give an example, if you had solar photovoltaic efficiencies of around 7 to 8% in the past, now those have actually increased to 15 to 16%, which is a substantial jump, which means for the same type of solar panel, you are actually generating double the electricity that you could have generated before. So that's one example. Other examples include other types of renewable energy sources. Let's take wind energy, or let's also take or run of the river hydro. In case of the wind energy, you will notice that initially everyone used to have the wind energy at 50 meters of mast height, and now the technologies have now gone up to 80 meters of mast height. The moment you do the efficiencies of the wind power generation goes up. So there have been, in short, substantial changes that we have seen in the solar, wind generation, biomass, biogas based electricity, waste to energy electricity, as well as pico hydro and nano hydro types of technologies. So that's the change that I've seen in the technological frontier. The other frontier that I've seen changing substantially is the pricing. So in the past, we all remember the solar photovoltaic electricity used to be available at 15 rupees, 14 rupees a kilowatt hour. That used to be very high. The recently concluded Solar Energy Corporation of India's bid in Madhya Pradesh revealed a price of something like 2.94 rupees per kilowatt hour. So that's a substantial change. Now, this change is not only visible in case of large scale, utility scale photovoltaic systems, but also in the rooftop systems, wherein we as consumers, if we were to procure a solar rooftop system for our own homes, independent houses, or a small commercial building, or even the small and medium scale enterprises rooftop, the price that we used to get exposed to in the past has reduced by at least 100%. So, which means in the past, water that was available to us at 12 rupees, now the landed cost or levelized cost of energy for a solar photovoltaic system on the rooftop for a consumer has reduced down to around 5 rupees, 6 rupees. So these are the two primary changes that I've seen. And at the same time, what I've seen is most of the new power generation assets that get built in the country and not only here in India, but elsewhere in the world as well, have gradually shifted from thermal based plants, which are the coal power plants or gas based generation, to solar based generation. And so much so that in the European continent, for example, gas based heating of the built environment is very common. Initially, they used to have coal based heating of the built environment. Then it moved to gas based, which was a lot cleaner. But now there is a proper move to substitute the gas based heating systems with solar photovoltaic based and battery power thermal systems and thermal heating systems in the households. So that's a substantial change that I've seen in the past decade itself.
Thank you. So you have highlighted the technical aspects of it and also the pricing aspect of it. There's another important factor which are the policies. Now, as you just mentioned, out of the 175 gigawatts, close to 40 gigawatts is expected to come from solar rooftop PV systems. So, do you think that the policies are in line to meet the 175, the 40 gigawatts that the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy is targeting by 2022?
Right. So let's term the solar photovoltaic systems or any kind of renewable energy penetration in the India's energy mix as a market transformation. The market transformation has two facets. One is a policy push and a market pull. The market pull comes when you have lowering of the landed cost of energy, and the policy push becomes evident when countries like India, European countries, and countries in Southeast Asia are a part of some kind of a global negotiation. And the global negotiation related to meeting the 1.5 degree temperature change that we're going to see during the coming decades. And if one way to reduce and sort of mitigate that kind of climate change, it's important for everyone to move forward with some kind of aggressive target to reduce the thermal power generation emissions, and obviously substitute that with the renewable energy portfolio obligations. So, if you look at what's happening at the global level, several countries have been asked to have some nationally determined contributions to the climate mitigation and climate adaptation space. So India has definitely committed to something like 175 gigawatt of electricity generation through renewable energy sources. Out of 175, 100 is supposed to come from solar photovoltaic, and out of 100 gigawatts coming from solar photovoltaics, about 40 is supposed to come from rooftop, and 60 is supposed to come from utility scale things. So that's something which we have committed voluntarily in the global climate mitigation space. Obviously, that is percolated down to what happens in the country. And there are several policies that have emerged, primarily coming from the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy and their state-based development agencies, such as Maharashtra Energy Development Agency or Cradle in Karnataka or the Gujarat Energy Development Agency in Gujarat. They have come up with state-specific solar energy targets. So that's another important policy aspect. The most important policy aspect that I have seen is essentially the institution of renewable portfolio obligations, which is a target set out by the respective state level electricity regulatory commissions on the distribution companies, wherein the initial target started with something like 3% or 1%, 1.5% of energy that is used by any kind of distribution company or distributed by the distribution companies to its consumers had to come from renewable energy power. Now, these renewable portfolio obligations have changed right up to 4%, 6% in certain states, which are specifically the states where you have high renewable energy incidences, so high wind, high solar. In those instances, you have seen very aggressive renewable portfolio obligations targets. So that's a function which is assumed by the regulatory commissions of electricity. And one must understand that electricity is a concurrent subject in India's constitution. So you have generation and transmission, which is governed by the Central Electricity Regulatory Commission, and the distribution companies are actually governed by the state level electricity regulatory commissions. So the RPO standards vary from state to state, and there is another very interesting opportunity that has happened, which is in the form of a market-based mechanism, something that we call as renewable energy certificates. That was mooted by the Minister of Power and notified as a regulation by the Central Electricity Regulatory Commission. So all of this is actually attracting a lot of investment in the renewable energy sources during the past decade, and that's a clear-cut regulatory effort, which is basically a policy push that has been offered to the renewable energy sector itself.
So clearly, in the solar rooftop space, there are two biggest stakeholders here. You have the customers on one side, and you have the distribution companies. The range of challenges that each of these consumers face is probably very varied. So could you give us a little insight into what are the key challenges that these two key groups of stakeholders face in terms of adoption of renewable energy systems?
Right. So in the electricity sector, the distribution companies are used to something called as long-term power procurement agreements, something what we term as PPAs. So these PPAs are signed by individual distribution companies, say a distribution company in Bangalore, another distribution company in Haryana, or another distribution company in Bihar. They sign something called as long-term power procurement agreements. And these are actually binding agreements wherein these distribution companies need to buy electricity from those plants with whom they have a contract. Now, actually, what's happening is the renewable energy pricing is actually going down substantially. So if you look at a new coal-based power plant, the landed cost of power could be something like 4.5 rupees, considering the flue gas desulfurization units that they need to put out, based on some of the new guidelines set forth by the Ministry of Environment, Forest, and Climate Change. As compared to that, the solar energy is probably available at a grid scale or something like 3 rupees or 4 rupees. And if you look at the operating cost and the vulnerability of reduction in the availability of water, which is required for thermal generation, compared to that, solar energy does not require all that water for its sort of functioning. So if you look at the long term and the operational cost as well, the solar energy definitely comes out as a winner. It's basically a very interesting winning proposition. Now, if you already have some kind of a contract with a thermal energy source for 25 years, it's going to be very difficult for you to sort of get out of that. So distribution companies always face that kind of a challenge. There is another challenge which is faced by the distribution companies, wherein to manage and to take care of the political economy of electricity distribution, some of the consumers are subsidized, and these are primarily in the agriculture sector and the low-income housing and small and medium-scale enterprises in certain cases. And who is subsidizing them? These are subsidized by the commercial and industrial consumer base. Let's call those as CNI consumer base. So if the average power procurement cost or average cost to serve for a distribution company is, let's assume, 6 rupees, what's happening is the CNI consumers actually pay close to 8 rupees, 9 rupees a kilowatt hour compared to an agriculture consumer who pays 1 rupee or 1.5 rupees a kilowatt hour. So now let's look at who can actually install solar rooftop. Solar rooftops can be easily installed by large commercial establishments, large industries, and so on, because they have rooftop space compared to high rises in cities like Bangalore, Gurgaon, Noida, Mumbai, Hyderabad, and so on, wherein you have very limited number of independent houses and you have very high stock of high-rise buildings. So your footprint that is available is actually a lot lesser compared to a commercial space rooftop or an industrial rooftop. Now, CNI consumers certainly would like to get cheaper power, but then they get bound by the regulatory commissions and more than the regulatory commissions by the distribution companies, where the distribution companies try to get some kind of a compensation of the revenue loss that they would incur if the CNI consumers indeed install rooftop PV. And what it means is the cross subsidy that would have been available to the distribution company would go away from the distribution companies. So that's the biggest challenge that is faced by the distribution companies. Now, as they face this challenge, they try to create some kind of regulatory barriers. So regulator says that you are allowed to charge some kind of a billing charge if a unit in, say, outskirts of Bangalore is importing solar energy from somewhere, someplace outside the state of Karnataka. If let's assume that it's importing it from Rajasthan. So there are a lot of charges that are applied. So there is a billing charge applied, there is a transmission and distribution charge that gets obviously embedded into the power pricing or the landed cost of power. So some of these sort of things create barriers for a CNI consumer. Okay. Then let's also look at the CNI consumer. If I have, say, 10,000 square feet of solar rooftop possibility compared to a 1 lakh square feet of solar rooftop facility or a utility grade system that can be installed by a distribution company. When I go into the market to procure solar energy or the equipment for the solar energy, which is primarily solar photovoltaic, the pricing that I get for 1 lakh square feet of tender compared to pricing that I get for 1,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 square root of tender, there is a difference. So obviously, despite the fact that some of the commercial and industrial establishments would like to go forward with the renewable energy in their energy consumption itself, they actually do not get very aggressive pricing from the market. So that creates a barrier for the CNI consumers. So we have actually gone through in this discussion the barriers that is faced, that the barriers that are faced by the distribution companies, and at the same time the barriers that are faced by the CNI consumer base.
Thank you. So, one final question for you, Dr. Mahesh. Um, Today, renewable energy is at the forefront of the conversation, not just in India, but also across the world. Now, there are several countries who have managed to blend together the technology, the policy, the regulatory framework, the entire spectrum of variables as far as renewable energy is concerned, and see a large scale impact in how this has affected the country. So, could you give us a couple of key examples here that in your opinion, have done wonders as far as renewable energy is concerned?
Sure. So I think I would like to cite the example of European Commission, which came up with a decree saying that whatever was their greenhouse gas emissions for the energy sources, from the energy sources, in 2005, they have committed themselves to meet the same targets or same level of emissions by 2025 or 2030. I don't recollect the exact number. But what's important here to note is that several continents are taking efforts to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions to pre-industrialization greenhouse gas emissions coming from those countries or continents as a whole. One interesting opportunity that I've seen and one interesting policy push that I've seen is in the European Union, wherein the EU came up with this kind of a energy efficiency directive and the renewable energy directive. And these two directives combined together actually have resulted in several distribution companies to start looking at what are the opportunities for me to get cheap power. Okay, and so that I can also contribute to the targets that have been set forth by their national governments and them being a member state in the European Commission. What is their sort of combined target and how can they really contribute to the combined target? The regulators in those constructs have actually done very interesting things. They have allowed the distribution company to start investing on the customer side of the meter. And these investments can happen in energy efficient appliances, substituting your energy guzzling appliances with energy saving appliances. That's sort of one set of investments. The second set of investments is in the battery energy storage systems. Third type of investments is basically in heat pumps. So all in all, what's happening here is that the distribution company is not selling you electrons. It's actually selling you some kind of a service. So if you look at a household in Belgium or household in Germany or in UK, what you actually require is basically heating energy. You don't really require electrons. Electrons is a means to get that heating energy. Let's look at another example. Lighting. Do you need basically lux at the level at which you are working on your table, right? You do not really require electrons to you're not purchasing electrons. You're essentially purchasing lux levels that you get at your tabletop. So the construct is actually moving from just selling electrons and making money to selling services. And that entire construct is actually coming to the rescue of the decarbonization. So all of this is treated as some kind of a decarbonization effort, wherein you are firstly conserving energy, secondly, you are using your energy efficiently, and the third thing that what you're doing is you're substituting your thermal-based electricity consumption or energy consumption with non-fossil fuel-based energy consumption. So these three things are actually coming to the rescue of the consumers. At the same time, these are also coming to the rescue of the distribution companies. There are several examples from Denmark, Norway, UK, Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, so on and so forth. there are several states in the United States of America, primarily the states on the northeastern side of the country there, states such as Maine, Vermont, and so on, who have taken very aggressive renewable energy targets on themselves. At the same time, California, as a large state, has also embarked on heavy investments in battery energy storage and also combined with the renewable energy targets that they have. So they have stated objectives such as by 2030, they would have 30% or 60% in certain cases as the share of renewable energy in their overall energy mix. So these are very aggressive targets and something that India can learn from.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mahesh, for the insight and for helping us get a better perspective of how renewable energy, the impact of renewable energy, both country and internationally. I'm sure our students will benefit very much from this fireside chat and this discussion.
Great. So good luck to your students and good luck to Peak. And I look forward to seeing some numbers of how many students you have trained during 2020, especially post COVID 19 changes that we are seeing in the learning process itself. So good luck to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today.